Welcome to the Advantage Podcast, a monthly unscripted conversation with host David Ashcraft and top leaders impacting our world. Created by pastors for pastors to strengthen our leadership and expand our knowledge and influence.
Hey, well, welcome everybody to the Advantage Podcast, and I have the privilege of having as our guest today, Mr. Doctor, and are you a doctor, Larry?
Well,
Larry Osborne. I don't think I've ever called you Pastor or Larry or Mister.
I'm Larry. I do have a doctorate, but my young son reminded me after I got it, and few people use that phrase. How come you're the kind of doctor who can't fix anything, Dad?
So where did you get your doctorate? Where did you do your...
Talbot.
Okay. All right,
Yeah.
Cool. So Larry is out in Southern California, was the pastor of North Coast Church, and is a pastor at North Coast Church still today. How many years have you been on staff at North Coast?
44.
That's amazing. Yeah. And led the church for the first 42 years you were there, I guess.
40 years, yeah.
40 years. Yeah. Okay, good. So Larry is definitely somebody that I consider a friend and appreciate very much. My first exposure to Larry was actually, I think, Larry, about 25 years ago. And I came across somehow your book called The Unity Factor, which what I remember at that time was it was very much about elder boards and how to work with your elder boards and things that way. So we had our elder board read it 25 years ago. And you were telling me that that was kind of a precursor to sticky teams.
Yes, yeah. Sticky teams, when they asked me to write that, had so much carryover because sticky teams are about your congregation, your board, and your staff. So it's kind of the DOS version. People still buy it on Amazon. I laugh because, like, why are you working with DOS? I mean, this is Windows age. It's AI age now. But yeah, I think I wrote it in the very late 80s.
Yeah.
Like that. So,
but Larry, even if it may be old, I still think, because I still pull things out of there from time to time, at least from my memory of it, and how to work with boards, and just it's a great tool and an easy read for people that are struggling and figuring out how to work with their boards. Which I was going to ask you, has anything changed in your opinion since you wrote that 25 years ago about how to work with boards, and how has that worked for you?
I think the reason that is sticky teams continue to sell are, number one, Satan's my number one marketing agent. He gets in there and stuff. And part of it is I wrote it when we were about 600, but having served as a youth pastor in large churches. So it's kind of that transition that scaled. I think probably the biggest thing I didn't realize is when you start hitting 6, 7, 8, 10,000, that the principles still apply, but a few of my illustrations I would probably broaden.
Yeah.
But the principles never change. Complexity is always solved by simplicity. And I might have had an illustration or two when, well, this is 8,000, this is 10,000, but really the principles didn't change that much. Things like a congregational meeting were before multi-site, certain things like that, like,
right.
You can't really have a congregational meeting when you got 11, 12 sites spread around distance. You got to rent the sports arena to have a meeting.
So, for us on congregational meetings, Larry, we early days when we were very small, just a few hundred, everybody would show up to the meetings because usually they were fireworks and they wanted to be there and didn't want to miss anything. But for the last 20 years, nobody shows up. And we actually, if we have more than 10 people show up in different meetings, we're concerned. And we have to do them once a year according to our bylaws, but we don't look for many people. So
yeah, that's kind of how we are. We normally have about 64 is kind of, so I would always take a picture, see how few people were in the room. It's about a 5-minute meeting. But the beauty, I actually liked it because the beauty was if we went sideways theologically, then thousands would show up and would vote no. All they voted on was a budget, yes, no, total numbers, and each elder. But it did give an accountability vehicle that at the end of the day, I went, I want to get rid of the cumbersomeness of it, but I'm not so sure I want to get rid of the accountability that held.
Actually, I like that, Larry, because I think a lot of times guys are trying to figure out how to streamline, simplify, take everything away from and create the perfect system. And I'm not sure there is a perfect system. And for us, we have to have a congregational meeting once a year, and we have to vote on buying property. And then I guess they vote on who the new elders are going to be. But what that does for us is it kind of gives us a checks and balances where when we're getting 98, 99% approval rating, we know everybody's happy with us. When it dips below that, we know there's something that's not quite right. So it's just a way for people to express something. So
Yeah, and my thing is, you know the huge numbers we have in small groups percentage
yes,
wise, and so I go, it's not apathy, it's trust.
yes,
I
exactly.
always want a vehicle. The old, I think it was Ronald Reagan had a phrase, trust and verify. So it gave a little bit of that. We actually got rid of the property thing a few years ago.
They do.
So when we were starting to buy properties 45 minutes away, an hour away, like where do we hold the meeting? People
Yeah,
have never even been out to that town. And so that was passed over even to our elders. So it just became money and elders. But
yeah.
again, a vehicle to say you guys are being foolish. Great. I don't mind that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great thing. So, a couple other ways that I know Larry. I was taking a DMin course at Trinity Seminary out in Chicago, probably also about 25 years ago, and came out. I don't know if you remember, Larry, you were teaching actually in Southern California at some law office that Trinity
Yep.
Seminary
I
owned.
remember the course.
Yeah, and so I came to that course, and you were teaching that. So that was my first face-to-face experience with you. And then I've had opportunity over the years to do mentoring with you through Leadership Network, and so just very much appreciate you, Larry, both as a pastor, as a leader, your open-handedness to helping other leaders and pastors. And so thank you for being the man, the leader that you are. Appreciate you very much.
Honored to be with you, Dave.
So, Larry, North Coast, you said you were there when it was several hundred people, and now it's in the tens of thousands, right? So,
Yeah. Yeah. There were 70 adults, I think, my first week. It was a church plant in a high school cafeteria, but I didn't do that hard work to get the 70 adults there. That had been done the first year and a half by a previous pastor.
so you were fairly new coming on. Yeah, that's great. And lots of change. One of the things that you innovated, you were very much a part of starting multi-sites, but you had something that was interesting that you have done where your different locations, actually on your main campus, you have several different venues with several different styles of worship, right? Are you still doing that today? And
Yes, if you were to go to our main mothership campus, you'd find 5 simultaneous services on Saturday night at 9 o'clock in the morning and the 11 o'clock service. Now, when we've had a 7:30 and a Sunday night or 12:45, those have been only one service, but we have different styles. So what happened is uh, we came up with video venues that eventually quickly became multi-set around the country. We had 3,000 people, a 500-seat sanctuary. And we don't market or advertise. I'm not theologically against it, but we were just a word of mouth church. And so I felt like almost like in Mark, where Jesus goes to the other side with the disciples for R&R, and they all followed him. Like we can't slow it down. If it's marketing, slow it down and figure out next. So I would just went down the beach. What could we do? And I got this goofy idea of an overflow room that was a reward. How can we make it a siphon instead of a punishment for being late? And it just exploded. And with about 3 years, everybody around the country was coming to take a look and see. And then we were more demographically focused.
okay.
And then quickly, two or three churches played with my toy the wrong way and cloned themselves geographically. And so quickly, it was like, oh, we need to do this too. So
Hmm.
contrary to a lot of what a lot of people think, we weren't the first multi-site. We created the venue of multi-site. And in fact, how innovation works, I had my XP who my whole staff was nobody's going to watch Saturday night service recorded, whatever until it worked. But after it worked, he came to me and said, we should like plant one of these. And I said, that'll never work. And then after two or three churches, Groeschel and some others visited us, saw how to do it and did it geographically, it was, I need to play with that toy that way too. And so we
That's
were early, but not the first.
so. What are your styles of worship, and have they changed over the years, or do you still pretty much have the same styles?
No, they've changed over the years. The beginning one was simply, it was back in the era where you didn't want to bring coffee into a worship center, even if it was warehouses or whatever. So originally it was Starbucks coffee, Cambros, and the reward element was unplugged music in a smaller room. and Danish is cut in half. God forbid somebody takes a whole one. Because we had no food, we want to get you out to get the next group in. And then when that room expanded, we realized, oh, what could we do when we filled that for another one? And we thought traditions, which in every region is different. Traditions in Southern California means singable hymns and probably choruses of the 80s that they think Martin Luther wrote. In another part of the country, it might be more liturgical with a Lutheran background or something. But we did our tradition, not looking around to find out what tradition is. Because every church has people, if you think of it as you grow as a circle that gets bigger and bigger, on the edge are people who love your church but wish it was. And so that became our core group. So it was
Oh, say
traditions.
that again. Say that again.
They
What does that
love,
mean? Wish it was.
well, they wish it was not so loud. They wish
Oh,
we
gotcha.
sang more of the singable songs. We wish it pushed the edge more. So our next one after that was The Edge, which back then was it, none of them were age driven. They were all mindset.
Yeah.
So traditions was, if you like, a traditional feel. It was never older people. Most older people like what we did regularly. And same with younger. It was if you like Mountain Dew and a big subwoofer, then you'll like that one. Now, that was in 2002. Over time, the things have changed. But the edge is almost, you take our college and early 20s, if they had church the way they wanted it, what would it be? So that's what we call our edge. Today, that's more of a concert feel with whoever's same guy on the screen, because you're preaching. I always tell pastors, I know this audience is significant churches. The demographic you're preaching can reach is always wider than the ambience of your room. And we really discovered that because I can reach a bunch of people who are traditions and I could wear jeans and flip-flops.
Yeah.
As long as they had their music and all that there, they were great with us on the screen. And same with the Edge. But if it felt like their dad's Oldsmobile. So then we had country gospel. We have the Message for men and ex-Catholics who don't like to sing. They're just word-oriented people. To our surprise, they were some of our top servers, donors, and everything. We thought it'd be a gateway service. It
Yeah.
wasn't at all. It was real word. They wanted a table to mark things up. So anyway, those are kind of things we do. We've had some failures. We
Yeah.
tried classics, a little bit of where did my music go? Singable music when worship songs became more of an industry. So they were hearing a complex performance song and then trying to sing it.
Yeah.
Which is, what most of us do nowadays. And I thought that thing would blow up and it just slowly died. So every now and then we go, oh, that doesn't work. So
That's good. And is there a favorite service? Is there one that seems to get a bigger audience than others?
It all depends. Actually, I'd say over the last 10 years, when we build a venue, we build lots of lobby space in which there's couches, high kind of cocktail table chairs and all that. And in most of our places, those fill up and our outdoor venue before the sanctuary or worship center, whatever you want to call it. So that has now become the overflow in many of our venues. Sorry, you're late. You got to go inside.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting.
Never saw that coming.
Well, and it's different for you in Southern California than for us in Pennsylvania, where but it
yeah.
rains maybe 2 weekends a year for you, something like that. So
Yeah, well, this year a lot, but yeah. So it really is like, for instance, the Edge. Back to the demographic. The early years, I took a survey. No surprise, 18 to 24 was the number one constituency, but then the number two, only 1 to 2% behind, was 40 to 49-year-olds
interesting.
who are
Yeah.
now approaching 70. But if
Yeah.
you look on the phone, they have Foo Fighters, they had Zeppelin, they have, whatever, and you're talking to one of those guys.
Yeah.
That would be my preferred service.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think I've ever asked you this. When you launch a new campus, a new location, do you have multiple styles of worship at the locations too, or is it pretty much one style?
Most of them start with one style, and as they fill up, then they add a second style. One of the more common ones we add is country gospel,
Hmm.
which is not my thing at all.
Hmm.
But once I realized the NASCAR race was outdrawing the NBA All-Star game, it's like, what are we doing? Nobody's doing that here.
Yeah.
And so they will do that, or they'll do more of an unplugged one. Maybe one of them has an outdoor as well as our main campus. So we just ask, in your group, what would be a reward element that a bunch of people would go, I want to go there, not I'm going there for the mission, because I always like to remind leaders, we're shepherds, our people are sheep, and we can't get mad at them for not thinking like a shepherd and being all missional. They want to know if their third grade son has all his friends in a class, they ain't moving services.
Yeah.
And probably none of us would either if we weren't
Yeah.
leaders.
Exactly. And Larry, one of the things I appreciate about you, you are so good at coming up with different analogies, or you just have a way of looking at things and being able to state what's going on in a simple way. And so appreciate that very much. One of the things I've heard you say over and over is pastors love full rooms, but the church people do not. And that's probably very true.
Yeah. The only people who like standing room only are the speaker and the band.
Yeah.
Nobody else likes it.
Yeah, exactly.
Like the long line at the restaurant. The
Yes.
owner likes it, but nobody waiting in line likes it.
Exactly. So, which makes me think of a question that we talked about. We just finished a series of cohorts with our Pennsylvania pastors. And one of the topics that came up is we used to always hear 80% full meant your room was full. And there was a sense from the guys in our cohorts saying it feels like post-COVID that number has dropped dramatically, that it's not 80% anymore. And we're not sure. And as we talked about it, is it 60? Is it 65, 70? And not sure, but any thoughts on that at all of what constitutes a full room now post-COVID?
Yeah, here's something I need to say on the front end. I might be missing a region, might think differently,
Okay.
but that has actually not been in my experience. The old 80% rule was a brilliant guy named Lyle Schaller. You might remember him,
So,
who knew everything about everything. And so he was kind of the Yoda of that day. And he pointed out that when your room is 80% full, it's actually 100% full. But what was going on back then is most churches had pews. And by the Uniform Building Code, every 18 inches is a person. So if it said 10 people, those were 10, 18-inch butts touching each other. And nobody sits that way. And most of us are not that small. And so what he was observing is a pew that holds 10 is actually full at 8.
interesting.
That's where the number came from. And then it just continues to float and float without realizing where it came from. When you set up chairs, there's a couple of issues. Was one, if you've got the room fully set up and people are sitting where they want, a lot of people are going to be like me. They want to sit on the back on an aisle and observe. So you get a donut hole. So you really are full at maybe 70%, but you got this big hole. At North Coast, we use an old youth ministry trick, being an old youth pastor, always set up the room for less people. So every service, we're setting up some chairs. And if I come into the room and there's a rope, it's not for me. And if I come into the room and there's a place in the back, I sit back there. But if there isn't, then I'm not begrudging having to go in 5 seats or whatever. So we fill the donut hole. And at that point, and a lot of churches I've worked with on this, they can get almost to 90%. And the real question of full is, can a group of 4 and one group of 5 find seating? Mostly 4s.
Yeah.
And the moment we have 1 or 2 groups of 4, you got to split up, we're full. And you can do a little bit of move in, but you can't do too much of that because they got there early to sit on the aisle.
Yeah.
So again, the post-COVID might be different in your region, but out here, that's kind of gone. And when I look around, people say it, it's more, when I visit the churches or speak there, I go, well, you got the donut hole guy. You need a little chairology and not aggressive, unkind ushering. Because if the chair's not there, so to give you an example, how much we do that is every venue builds with a chair rail to hide them. So we literally between services take down 2, 3, 4 rows. So even though, well, we're going to set them up next service, I know we are, but it's not for the facility teams, it's for the people.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
I actually think it's a higher number if you run through that grid.
Yeah, interesting. And I was going to say, you guys follow that very closely because at least the times I've visited some of your locations, there was one location that I think they took every chair out and maybe had a couple rows right up front and then started filling in very quickly as people were coming. And it was
That
amazing.
might have been, if it was a really small venue, it might have been. Normally, we set up the room 3/4 so that
Okay.
you're setting up. Let's say I was just with a church helping in Sacramento just this last weekend, and it was set up 3 rows. Now
Okay.
here's a mistake. when they get a group of 4 that needs seating, they don't set up 5, they set all the way across the back. Well, then the next 20 people are going to take those seats.
Right.
So you have to train them. I call it chairology. I wish I'd had the course. But what I don't want is so crowded, I'm uncomfortable. Because
Yeah.
I think comfort's more important than capacity. Make
Yeah.
your rooms a little wider. But I do want to do what I can to cast energy in the room. And there's
Yeah.
a fullness kind of factor that does that without being uncomfortable.
Yeah, very much so. So Larry, what you're kind of hitting on, there are factors that cause church growth. I mean, obviously, God and his spirit moving and our ability to speak makes a difference, but there's some other factors that are big, either inhibitors to growth or things that propel growth. So even as you're talking about chairology, I think that's a simple one. You've talked about pinch points for growth, and again, you use an analogy of washing your car, but describe that when it comes to being able to grow as a church and things that stop us from growing.
I think there's very few things that can make us grow. There's lots of things that can stop our growth. And it's almost like Maxwell talked about a lid in a leader. Every leader has a lid, but the first lid they hit is usually not their real lid. That's why a PGA golfer has a coach or whatever. And I find a lot of churches, they do have a built-in DNA lid. You're not going to grow forever. But they often hit an early lid, and it's one of the inhibitors. So the first time, if I'm a church, man, we just stopped growing. What happened? This doesn't answer all the questions, but it's the first thing I go to. I'm a very bad artist, but I draw a little old school Volkswagen and the 4 tires and ask people, have you ever washed a car? Yeah. Ever got the hose stuck under a tire? Yeah. Well, what do you do? Well, you don't go and hook the hose up to a fire hydrant. That'll just blow up the hose. You don't spend $300 on a nozzle. You move it out from under the tire. And I see there's 4 tires that inhibit growth. Often, right away, you can see the hose is stuck under this. And they're in no order. I'm going to give them in an order, but every time I give it a different order because you get the hose stuck under the right front tire is not better than the left rear tire. So the first one is worship capacity. Like once you're full, whether it's going to be 60 because people are afraid. By the way, on that COVID thing, I'm not seeing that in restaurants or ball games. That's why I think it's not really in churches.
Yeah,
We've missed that. I could be wrong, but
yeah, interesting.
but when there's not room, people quit inviting their friends, and they don't come anymore. The second one would be parking. You can't outgrow your parking. At North Coast, we were in warehouses. You might have visited during that time, David, and we kept buying new warehouses, adding new venues, and they'd blow up and fill up. And then at one point, we were having to have 500 cars park off site per weekend. And we did everything we could, made it real kid friendly. So they told their parents we have to do it. But there was no way we were going to get more than 500 cars parked off. And so we had a new venue, and all the leadership's wondering why we're not growing. Well, until we solve the parking problem. Okay, so that's a second or four, whatever.
Yeah.
The next one is kids space. Judge through the eyes of a mom who's afraid her kid's going to catch some disease. Because I find our regular people don't mind a crowded room. We have the wrong eyes. So we don't understand the difference between the person who comes back and the person who brings a friend. And so I see lots of, well, it's kind of working. It's a bit full, not understanding that you've got a lot of people, almost like the restaurant. When the food's not good, they say, how is it? I go, fine. You probably do too. And they don't tell you why their kid didn't like it, who was more introverted or quiet, or they were afraid.
Yeah.
And then the fourth one is
They just don't come back again, right? They don't tell you. They just leave. Yeah.
Yep. So you got those 3. You got worship space, parking, kids. And then the fourth one is decision-making processes. And so, for instance, if you or I were still saying we have to have a congregational meeting with a quorum, I'm dead. I got to rent the sports arena for an annual meeting. And there are, in my own tribe, I see a lot of churches that can't break the 2,000 to 3,000 barrier because of polity or staff expectations or how decisions are made. So, like for instance, on our board, to give an example, with all of our campuses and the number of services we have, I think pre-COVID it was 156, now it's 126. Like I have a great board, but if they wanted to manage, the problem is not they're not smart or godly enough, they're not present enough.
Hmm.
It'd be like me taking all the churches on this. I am gifted with wisdom and leadership, but I don't have boots on the ground. So some of my advice is terrible advice if I had boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And so we had to shift to our board having a different kind of role because they had to move to wise counsel instead of any sort of management because how could they know anything? They weren't there. They had a day job. So those are the four. And I see it pretty commonly, especially a church that was going well and suddenly hit a wall. What happened is often one of those four.
So it feels like, Larry, it's pretty obvious if you're out of kid space or out of worship space or out of parking. I mean, you could see that it's tangible, it's there in front of you. The decision-making process it seems like it could be a little bit harder to detect. And so a lot of the guys in our groups are in the range of 1,000 to 3,000 people in their churches. And you made the comment that you see churches hit lids when they're around 2 or 3,000 because of this very issue. So how would somebody know that they need to change their decision-making process?
Great question. Let me add one more thing on the tires that I kind of left out, and that is you need to fix whichever tire the hose is stuck under the most. I'll watch people build children's space when they don't have parking, or it's incredibly common to me how they can see the three, but they violate the principle of fix it. But
Hey, Larry,
basically,
can I just say one other thing to that as well? One of the things that I experienced at LCBC, we never had the money to do everything. And so you fix one thing and then it all of a sudden you fix the parking and now all of a sudden the kid space is gone. And so there would always be naysayers that would say, well, why didn't you think far enough down the road to know that you were going to be out of kid space? And my response was always, I think I probably knew, but we didn't have the money to do that. And had we tried to do the whole project at once, we never would have gotten off the ground because we didn't have that kind of money. And so I think sometimes pastors freeze themselves or they stall out because they're trying to do everything at one time. And to your point, pick the one that's worse and fix that, and then worry about the next one, but do one at a time.
if you wait for a perfect solution, you're going to do a lot of waiting.
Yeah, yeah,
You know, incremental movement and growth is a strong way to go.
exactly.
So back to decision making. Uh, One of the things that I ask is how much miscommunication is there? That's usually a sign that if you're saying one thing, they're hearing another. That's a sign that they're not around enough. So David, you and I, let's say we hang around a whole lot. We almost get code, right? Because I say something and you see it. But the less we hang around, I say something and you might use a different dictionary.
Yeah,
And so what I find, especially when it comes to boards, that a lot of boards are made up of people who really don't know anybody who's new to the church in the last 2 years. They've never been to this particular campus or service. And so one of the things is they still want to make decisions even though they're not present.
interesting.
Another is that things get too big. Uh, and I often use a complexity illustration that if you and I are working together, or we're two campuses or two ministries within the church, we have two lines of communication. If we add a third, we go to 6. We add a fourth, we go to 12. We add a fifth, we have 20 lines of communication. So people will think I just added one more staff person to our executive team. Well, you exponentially increase the complexity. And now you've got people who don't speak up until after the meeting in the hallway. Uh, you go from 4 to 5 campuses or 2, 1 to 2 is pretty simple. You start hitting 3 or 4, the jump in complexity is so large, but you're still trying to use the same reporting processes.
Yeah.
That's more what I see it is things that used to work stop working, and there's an increase in low-level frustration. Those two things tell me something's wrong with our structure.
Yeah.
So this is not bad people that slowly increases frustration. It's bad system.
And Larry, I think that low level of frustration is a good indicator. And I think sometimes we misinterpret that and we think, oh, there's something relationally going on or there's something spiritually going on, when it may be as simple as just changing procedures or policies. And yes,
Yeah, and you're always going to lose some people. Think of a bus. It's got a sign on the front of it, and so it says it's going here in Southern California to Carlsbad. and then it flips over to Oceanside, there's always some people who get off the bus when it says Oceanside. And I think sometimes we feel that people shouldn't leave the staff or the church, and it's really okay. You're going from one Starbucks to a smaller one, or you're going to Seattle's Best, and Starbucks owns that as well. So the branch manager is concerned, but the Starbucks isn't. And I think we need to look at the kingdom that way. There's nothing wrong with you if you like a golf-sized team versus a football-sized team. And what happens is when you do take complexity to make it simple, people lose, I call it the three Ps: power, prestige, or preference. And some people can't get over that. And it's not they're sinful. It's not that they don't love Jesus and the kingdom. They're wired that way. Big L leaders are wired for power. If they suddenly get shut out and can't do anything, they'll go somewhere else. Prestige, you used to be on the know of everything, and now you go to your life group or small group and, hey, I hear we're ending a service, and you go, I didn't know that. That's a kick in the gut. And I as a leader, I had to learn to understand and validate loss rather than have that all things for all people that I might reach some, which is Paul describing his apostleship,
Yeah.
not every Christian.
So Larry, even when we were together with our cohorts, that very issue came up of saying, okay, we've been operating, maybe there are 15 on staff, and we've been trying to all meet together, and now we're having to go to more of an exec team, but somebody's going to get excluded. Not everybody's going to be at the table anymore. So can you remember back when you were growing through those spells and you had to move to places where some people are getting left off, and you talked about the three Ps, but somebody's going to get left off. How did you make that decision? How would you encourage the guys to make those decisions?
Well, first of all, a lot of it has to do with the leader's willingness to not always be first.
Okay.
So anybody who knows my history, I mean, I think we were the first church that did a shared pulpit. So we had models of me saying I want to be a Barnabas, because everybody claims to be Barnabas until David shows up, and then they're King Saul.
Yeah.
So a lot of it, you set the DNA by how you, if you're a lead pastor, behave. But on top of that, I made some mistakes early on because, again, I assumed everybody ought to be ready to charge the hill, all things for all people. And I projected my leadership gift and calling on them. But once I understood, like, okay, there's a problem here, I began to ask questions like, can I break this meeting into two meetings that are each half as long? And now we don't have family system and the introvert not speaking, plus people got time with me. And once in a while, I had to have that conversation of, I need you to move to another seat. And the kind of people we hired, I only had one. I was lucky. I had one problem where somebody just couldn't do that. Other people, they were hurt, they were sad, but we worked through it, A, by model, and B, by the kind of people on the team. But it's never fun. But if you're building a team of people who are kingdom oriented, and then you're willing to say, think of the Lord's Prayer, the shepherd. He makes me lie down in still waters. That means makes me lie down in green pastures. That means they don't want to lie down. But the other side, he leads me beside still waters. Sheep are afraid of running water. There's no chance they're going down the river with a shepherd there, but he still finds still or quiet waters or dams it up. And I felt that was my job when I was asking people to change roles. What could I do to put myself in their shoes? They lowered their job. Could we still keep their pay what it was? Why do we have to, quote, be good stewards instead of golden rule type of leaders? Could I find a way to give them space? But after I'd done all that, once in a while, they need to get off the bus. I want to honor them. They're not a bad guy, bad gal.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So Larry, we talked a little bit about multi-site, the fact that you guys have multiple campuses or locations. How many North Coast campuses are there now?
I think we're on 11.
Okay. All right.
That are not microsites, but campuses.
Yeah. Okay. And you and I have talked a little bit about what really makes a multi-site, what's not a multi-site. And one of the things that I'm hearing more and more is people acting like multi-sites don't work anymore. And I feel like what doesn't work is the model that many people are trying with multi-site, where they're trying to do live teaching at 4 or 5 locations. And, each campus wants to go its own way with their pastor. And so they're experiencing lots of trouble. So then they just give up on multi-site. But I don't think it's the multi-site. I think it's the model that's not working. But what's your thought on that?
Totally. Obviously, being very involved at the beginning of multi-site, I worked with a lot of the early churches, and I think of a lot of guys and gals who's ever listening might know names of Jim Tomlin or Greg Ligon, who both kind of became spokesmen in that area and did a great job. But one of the areas I'd always push back on them is we're so excited about multi-site, we're using imprecise words.
Hmm.
If you have live teaching, you're not multi-site, you're multi-congregational.
Hmm.
Just like you would be if you had 3 services Sunday morning, a different preacher at each one, you're multi-congregational. And eventually that church will spin out. It might be when Moses dies, it might be way down the road, or it might be 3 months, because preaching leaders eventually want to shape the culture. And when there's 1 or 2, it works okay. By the time you get 3, 4, or 5, your bigger L leaders are always going to spin out. I have no problem with that model. It's been around for 2,000 years. It's how every denomination, every tribe always started with a great church. People wanted the same value and DNA. So you go back to the early Jesus movement, Calvary Chapel would have been even bigger than Life Church, because all their churches followed Chuck's model, Smith's model, and all that. So it's similar to multi-site, but a little different. Multi-site has the same message. You can have different worship sets and stuff, but the DNA is the message.
Right.
And so I always ask people why you're doing it. So there's 2 issues where I go, it didn't work. They did it because it was cool, and therefore it didn't work. And they had no really idea. They thought they'd spin out a teacher who'd be a little puppet. Well, of course it didn't work. But the other thing, even in multi-site or multi-congregational, is all of us in the early days made the mistake of putting a shepherd in charge, because we thought, we've got the momentum, we've got the teaching on screen, we got the mojo. We just need somebody to bring love to this group. Well, you give a shepherd 375 people. 3 years later, they'll give you 370 or 400, because that's what shepherds do.
Yeah.
They're shepherds who lead, but they don't grow.
Right.
And so I find often when people tell me it didn't work, they did it because, well, we're supposed to. It's a cool thing to do. They had no momentum, no boots on the ground, and they didn't put a leader there.
Yeah.
Well, we failed in our early days that way. I have a blog out there that I hate to say, but it says, "Has no one noticed that multi-sites never get above 500?" It was probably written around year 6 or 7, and that's because we're all putting shepherds in them.
Interesting.
Now, like, there's multi-thousand sites, right?
Yeah.
And so that raises the obvious question, David, which is, well, what do I mean by a leader? Because a leader has to shepherd, but and there's 2 things I look for. In the rearview mirror, does everything they touch grow? So like when our high school was at 150 and there was a change of youth pastors, I'm looking around for a youth pastor who had a group of 250. Wrong question. I need to ask, what was it when you started?
Yeah.
Not, how to do 250. Because I'd rather have a guy who started at 70 and now it's 120 take over our 150, if that makes sense.
Right. Right.
So leaders grow things. It's in their rearview mirror, past this prologue. And then the other thing I'm looking for is what I call the Tom Sawyer gift. Can you get people to paint the fence for you and thank you for it? Every big L leader has a bunch of people that paint the fence for them and thank them for it. Every shepherd feels that's manipulating and using people, and shepherds paint the fence. And when they're done, they ask, anybody else need a fence painted? So they always need more staff, more whatever, because they're not wired to grow. So I tell people, multi-sites are working great. By the way, so is multi-congregational among those who understand what it is.
Right.
It will never work great when you put a shepherd non-grower and you'd say, grow this thing.
That's good. That's good. So you've used the term big L leader several times. For people that haven't been around you, what do you mean by that? How do you define that? And how does that differ from a little L leader?
Well, it's just really almost the size of the things they do.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. It feels awkward to say it, but I'll just be blunt. The 2 youth groups I had, as a youth pastor, were the largest in the history of their church. Then I came to North Coast. A lot of people know the story. We grew by one. It took me 5 years to be able to add a staff member. Lots of self-doubt because everything had grown and a lot of teaching the Lord was doing. But basically, when I touch things, they grow big. So I would be a big L leader. There are other people, their leadership capacity is more mid-size. They took a group of 15 kids and grew it to 50 or 60. Well, that's awesome. But
Yeah.
that's not the same as the gift who grew it to hundreds.
Right.
And so actually in some of our campuses, we look at it and we go, I don't think this campus in this community is probably going to get above 600-700.
Yeah.
So I don't need somebody who builds things to 2,000 because they're going to be very frustrated when they hit 6 or 7. So that's what I mean. A big L leader or shepherd, their primary gift is to grow. Their secondary gift is shepherd. And if they can't shepherd, they're a terrible leader. Same
Yeah.
like shepherds grow things, but what do they primarily do?
Right. And so how, when you talk about that, it can almost sound harsh towards the shepherd or
Absolutely. And I don't mean that at all. Yep.
and yet we know from a church standpoint, if we want to grow the church, what you're saying is exactly true. And so yeah,
Shepherds are more important than leaders. You look at the persecuted church, when they put the leaders in prison, the church goes on. When the shepherds are put in prison, the church disappears.
yeah,
It goes underground without leaders. So, but I always ask the question, what do I want this thing to do? And by the way, I don't think everything needs to grow.
yeah,
There's certain things. And so when it doesn't need to grow, let's put a shepherd there. Or I want a little bit of growth, let's put a shepherd there because they'll grow it healthy
yeah,
and it just won't be massive. But when we just bought a new campus and there's 400 people there and a potential of 12, 1,500, it's unfair to the person with a shepherd gift.
right.
Just like you wouldn't want to, that's one reason I never jumped at another job as a successor.
Yeah,
I'm wired to build from the ground up.
yeah,
And I do that really well, but that also is not a good gift when you've got, a healthy church like LCBC, say, or North Coast, and it's time for the lead pastor to pass on the baton.
yeah,
You don't want somebody else to come in and reinvent every wheel.
exactly, exactly.
It's a weird thing. I believe as a leader, the body of Christ is not a theological construct. It's a reality. And I think most of it think it's a construct. But if people would grow up, they'd be like me.
So what's the difference between a theological construct then and reality? What do you mean by that? Just
Well, well, we don't accept it. A mission trip opened my eyes to a compassion for the world. So now I want everybody to go on a mission trip.
okay.
So we treat people almost like the old B.F. Skinner whacked out psychologists who thought we were born an empty slate and we're shaped by our environment. So we spend all our discipleship is read the book that changed me, do the thing that changed me, and it doesn't. Same
Yeah,
thing with anybody with multiple kids.
yeah,
Well, on the first kid, you think you got it wired, and the second kid, the same exact recipe,
yeah,
response. So I spent a lot of time in my life trying to help people be a better them than a poor imitation of me.
yeah. That's good. Okay, I like that. So we've got just a couple more minutes. Let me ask you a couple things real quick, or ask you to share a couple things that I think impacted me. One time you came to LCBC, you were talking with our staff, and you gave the illustration of the Pony Express rider. And describe what that is just real briefly, because I think that's something that's helpful for people.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to volunteers, there's a lot of things we forget. People sign up for the job, they stay for the relationships. And so, we just keep recruiting and then walk away and don't build a true team of people who like each other. The second most important thing that undercuts volunteers in my mind is we forget that the people who serve are more important than the people they serve. As a leader, remember, Jesus said everybody should be a leader if you want to set up my right or left. We need to become a servant all the way to a slave. So you want to grow as a leader, I'm going to teach you to serve. But if you're a volunteer, you're not asking me a leader, you're just saying, I want to help out. And so at the end of the day, I think we project our calling, the kind of people that are on this podcast. And mine was others first, others first. The higher you want to rise, the more you're a servant. I put that on my volunteers unfairly. But I like to use the analogy of the Pony Express. If I owned the Pony Express back in the day, what's more important, the pony or mail? Well, they're both obviously important. But at the end of the day, I can lose the mail every now and then and still go on. But if I kill the ponies, I'm dead. And a lot of our churches, we think the mail is more important than the ponies. And like, no wonder we burn out our volunteers or can never find enough. So we always focused on how do we make this job doable and rewardable. And then if you kind of raised your hand or showed God's calling to be a leader, oh, we got you on another track.
Yeah, that's
And
and I know that was huge for us, Larry, to hear. And just thinking through how do we take care of the ponies at LCBC? Are we taking care of them? Are we abusing them? And probably when you came and talked about that, we were on the side of probably abusing our ponies. And so we've had to make a shift that way. So that's real helpful. Another thing that you told me that was real helpful, I don't know that I was ever good at this one, was you know, many of us are oftentimes accused of being too shallow in our preaching. We're not deep enough. And so you challenged me at times as we would talk about this, that and you'd say that you would just throw bones to the people that were looking for
yeah.
deeper teaching. So describe that real quick and what that would
Okay.
look like. And I'm sure
Well,
nobody else on this call has heard that argument or that critique of it,
yeah.
but I had
Well,
heard it. So
the way I'm wired, I'm an unapologetic Bible guy. I got a Bible verse for everything, even if it's out of context. So my orientation is to be that teacher. I do have a strong practical side. So I didn't really never got the you're not feeding me or whatever because of the way I'm oriented and you get real practical. But as I would step and hear them say that about other people, I'd go, that's totally unfair. That was great stuff. I learned something. So I tried to figure that out. Like, why are they doing this comparison and criticizing what is healthy discipleship preaching over here? And then it hit me one day. They want to hear something they've never heard before once in a while. And that's where I came up with the phrase, throw a bone. I realized I was doing that naturally. Well, you have always heard, but let me point out, and all you got to do is have one of those every couple of weeks. You don't spend a whole lot of time on it and they go, oh, that's deep. And then after that, like,
they're
I'm
fine.
sorry, I'm actually preaching pretty simple stuff with a total topical application of it at the end that they're criticizing another environment. So I've often told people if you can just sit down and say, what's the thing I used to always believe, but now I've noticed this, or what's the thing you assume in this passage that if you can just phrase it that way, I used to think, or a lot of people say, not in a critical way of other churches and pastors, they'll just go, oh, that's so deep. And I'm rolling my eyes. Okay, now I can go back to talking to regular people.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, just a little helpful tip. So I appreciate that. So you've written a bunch of books. Are you writing a new one now?
I am playing with one.
Yeah.
I've got a couple they want me to do, but I actually started maybe. Zondervan was asking me Larry's Larryisms.
That's good. That would be a great book, actually.
Kind of like my plumb lines. And so it's just a little sense of, your potential is your calling is more important than your potential. Do your best and take a nap. Why that matters.
Yeah.
Just the life little things with a couple thousand words on each one. So I might do that. The others they've been
Cool.
bugging me to do. I
Yeah.
like having written. I don't like writing.
And so how many books have you written?
10, I think. Yeah.
10. And do you have a favorite?
Well, that's like a favorite kid. I write, as people know,
Yeah.
some people know. I write mysteries and cookbooks, which the publisher hates because what's your brand? So the cookbooks are my leadership books, and the mysteries, my favorite, are actually Thriving in Babylon, Contrarian's Guide to Knowing God, Accidental Pharisees. Because at the core, leadership without discipleship is a waste of time. And I think God's humor on me was like, you're going to be known as a leadership guy. And I wanted to be known as a discipleship guy. So I refuse to go just leadership stuff. I go, no, I want to Accidental Pharisees and Thriving in Babylon. Lead Like a Shepherd is the closest blend. So.
Yeah, that's good. Thriving in Babylon was a great book, is a great book. And if guys are struggling, just trying to figure out how do we lead and how do we exist in a culture that seems to be against everything we stand for, that's a great book to read. And so we actually did a series off of that, probably even a couple series off of that at LCBC. And so just a real good book. So appreciate that, Larry. Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, well, thank you for taking time with us. It's always a joy to talk with you, and I would thoroughly enjoy. I think a lot of people would enjoy that book that you said Sondervan was asking about Larryisms. I think that would be a real popular book and something that people could hang on to. But thank you for just being a leader that's been consistent and strong and faithful and pure for the most part over the. I don't say for the most part. I just don't mean
Thank you.
I don't want to present as though you're perfect, but you're close to it. So appreciate you and just who you've been and who you are. So thank you, Larry, very much.
Well, thank you. And I so appreciate all you guys who are listening, man. Keep it up for the kingdom. And this whole concept you're doing in Pennsylvania is awesome.
Yeah, Larry, we're at a stage we've got the guys that are part of our original cohorts, which is a 65, and now they're task over the next couple of months to go out and find 10 guys that they're going to be mentoring and leading. And so all of a sudden, 65 goes to 650. And we feel like when that happens, then we're going to start seeing some cool things happen in Pennsylvania, just more people coming to Jesus. So we're excited about that next stage.
If I can take a moment of encouragement, because I'm in a unique situation where across the country and completely different tribes within the body I get the privilege of working with, I do not know what it means, but something's happening. It's too early to tell, jump to a conclusion, but it's amazing across the country. I keep running into, hey, record attendance here, record this, record that. And most of us are living in our bubble, not knowing how something is stirring. And it might just be the darker it gets, the brighter the light shines. But very noticeably over the last 6 months, I'm hearing that story everywhere and everywhere. So
yeah, that's good encouragement. And that's what we heard that with our pastors in Pennsylvania over and over. I was just at lunch today with somebody here in Chicago that said they had their highest attendance ever this past weekend, not a non-holiday. So yeah, I think you're right, which is encouraging. That's cool to see.
it's all across the country, all kinds of different tribes. So
Yeah,
maybe Aslan is stirring.
that's cool. That's good. Larry, thank you. Appreciate the time.
Okay, thank you.
All
Appreciate
right,
you.
we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Advantage Podcast with David Ashcraft and for participating in our goal to strengthen and encourage pastors and their churches so more people are introduced to Jesus across Pennsylvania. If you found this helpful, feel free to pass it along. To find out more about the work of The Advantage, visit our website at theadvantage.org.